Difficulty is important, because the most popular choice in almost every video game I play happens before I even get to any gameplay. It's not what my character looks like or even which character I want to be. It's how difficult I want my experience. And despite it seeming like a very straightforward question, difficulty in video games and its implications have gotten widespread and complex. Having this option presented to me at almost every game I played in the last couple of years has really made me think about a lot of questions. What is difficulty in video games? What does it mean for a game to be difficult? Should all games be difficult? Should all games be customizable in difficulty? Why do we exist? Are certain games actually easier over time? And should we even give players control of what they want to experience?
Depends on the type.
As you can see, video game difficulty is a varied topic that is almost too complex for a YouTube video. This is because there are so many different types of difficulty, mechanics and systems, as well as different genres of games that have very different combat systems or even ways to play. But by looking at three major pitfalls that difficulty in video games often have, I think we are going to discover that more games need better difficulty balancing and philosophies than we initially thought. Because difficulty has problems. Released in 1985, nearly 40 years ago, Super Mario Bros. Is an evolutionary title that has inspired and affected countless games, and it is probably the simplest example of difficulty that we can look at. Super Mario Bros. Has two aspects that are fundamental to understanding difficulty. The first is levels that get harder as you move through them. World 1, Level 1 is easy compared to World 4, Level 2. The further you get in the game, the more difficult it is, and the more your skills are put to the test. Progression is important. To consistently test your abilities in a slowly increasing way is something that all games try to do, but don't always succeed at. This principle of adding challenge as time goes on is fundamental to difficulty. Second, Super Mario Bros. Has a more challenging version once you beat the game. This is essentially a hard mode. Enemies are replaced with stronger enemies, and they technically move faster, making things more difficult on the player. This represents an additional challenge after you beat the game. It's a small touch that allows players to test their skill even further, and this is accomplished by developers actually changing parts of the game to compensate for a mastery in player skill. The skill that the player hones over the course of the game is basically jumping at the correct times, and knowing how enemies move and what attacks they do. It all boils down to when you jump and where. This means that mastering Mario is about timing. This is a skill that's not easily exploited. In fact, for lack of a better term, it's really grounded. People who are really good at this game will master exactly where to jump and when. In other words, the game does a good job of teaching you its core mechanics and pushes you in them, without allowing you an easy way out. So why am I talking about Mario in a video about difficulty? Because it's a simple game, with a simple goal and a simple way to win. It's a great basis for a case study to use when looking at the core mechanics of video game difficulty. Not every game from this era is balanced, and I don't want to give off the impression that games back then were easier, because they definitely weren't. But almost 40 years later, we have more issues with difficulty than we ever have. While games may be better balanced, and as a whole, a lot easier, game difficulty is way more convoluted than it ever has been. And I think if we take a look at a few games around us in the contemporary era, we see that there are some key problems that games have developed as a result of increased complexity in game mechanics. Before we explore more games, let's get on the same page. Let's define difficulty. This seems simple at first, but in reality, it's quite the opposite. Let's define difficulty in a video game as the amount of skill necessary to overcome whatever challenge the game presents to you. For example, a section of a game that requires a deeper understanding of the mechanics, or in other words, a higher skill level, would be considered hard. One that has a low skill requirement would be considered easy. This skill comes in both knowing the game and being able to execute your strategy in a mechanical sense. Fairly straightforward, right? Well, kind of, because while hopefully my definition is easy to understand, I have found that games implement ways to achieve this definition wildly differently. In other words, different games have different rules and have different victory conditions. A game like Kingdom Hearts is going to be way different in how you master the game than, say, the previously mentioned Super Mario Bros., or Elden Ring, or Spider-Man, or The Witcher 3. Most of these games handle difficulty well in some aspects, but they also have serious flaws. And by diving into a few of these games, we can discover how they use different mechanics to create a sense of challenge. And by diving into these mechanics, we can pinpoint where I think there are massive problems for the entire industry. As I said before, I am going to look at 3 categories of games with different difficulty failings. I think that regardless of genre or developer, multiple games fall into these overarching categories easily. We'll be talking mostly about specific games as examples and how they represent these categories. This will make things a bit easier to understand, but it will also contextualize my complaints, thoughts, and ideas. Here's the most problematic issues that plague difficulty today. 1. Games often feel like they have an over-reliance on difficulty settings over a traditional difficulty progression. 2. Knowledge often replaces skill instead of complementing it by having broken gameplay systems that are imbalanced. 3. Games implement overly simplistic difficulty measures and differences that make harder difficulties a chore or just boring rather than fun. I'll break down each of these, but before that I wanted to make a few things clear. Most games that I have played are guilty of at least one of these problems, but almost no game is guilty of all 3. Except maybe one. I'll even use the same game as an example of how to do difficulty well in some areas, and at the same time, use that game to explain how it does difficulty poorly in other areas. There is so much more to a game than by how easy or difficult it is. If I mention your favorite game and talk about how broken it is, it's probably not because I hate it, but because I like it and I have played it enough that I have experienced this firsthand. There are some exceptions though, so I guess don't think too hard about it, I'm just trying to make a YouTube video. Lastly, I want to emphasize that I am not a game designer, and I'm sure that it is extremely difficult to make a balanced game. But I think that by the end of the video, we will all agree that these modern problems that I am presenting have as much to do with game design philosophy as it has to do with small tweaks in game balancing. First up on the list, let's talk about difficulty settings, difficulty curves, and accessibility. It's kind of an understatement to say that Elden Ring is known for being a difficult game. In my opinion, this is mostly due to its core game design and mechanics. You have your basic roll to dodge enemy attacks, light and heavy attacks of your own, and parry timings to perfect. When it comes to the Land Between's most formidable foes, the game has a reliance on boss patterns that are difficult to predict, and you'll have to carefully learn when bosses will stop attacking and time your openings carefully. All this is wrapped in an open world that has traditional elements of Souls-like games. Limited healing unless you defeat a horde of enemies in the open world, having to rest at a particular checkpoint and reset all enemies, dying and losing your experience and having to travel back to where you died only to die again by the exact same monster, which makes your experience point loss permanent. This is just the tip of the iceberg for Elden Ring, with spells and different weapons you can use, and builds you can sculpt your character into. If you have played any of From Software's games, and the dozens that have been inspired by them, these mechanics are very familiar. If you haven't, you have probably heard or can at least comprehend how difficult these games can be. But I want to ask a question to those that both have and haven't played. Why do you think From Software titles are so memorable, and therefore successful? There's a lot of reasons, including atmosphere and a refreshing approach to hands-off storytelling, but I think part of the biggest reason why is because of the difficult gameplay, but more specifically, the discipline and perseverance it takes to learn the opponent's attacks, and the triumph after fully defeating and conquering an opponent. It takes skill, patience, and a long road of failure to get good at these games. And when you finally beat a boss that you've been dying to for possibly hours, the feeling is unlike any other. Ask any fan of the genre and you'll hear stories about how they beat a certain boss for the first time. I'm slowly making my way through Elden Ring as you are watching, and my friends and even family members have badgered me to play more of their games after I am done. I've only been able to partake in some discussion about a fabled FromSoft boss triumph, and of the discussions that I have been able to partake in, it is a unique feeling. But of the discussions I haven't been able to partake in, I can tell that there's something special when you do beat one of these bosses, and it makes me desperately want to join in on obliterating a new crazy difficult boss. But it is only this way because Elden Ring, or any FromSoft game, does not have any sort of difficulty customization. You're on a set road with a challenge to overcome, and that road is the same for every single person that plays this game. It forces you to beat it at its own terms. Now, difficulty options have always existed in video games, but they have never been more prevalent in gaming until recently. With all these new games giving you so many options, this means that you get to customize your experience and how much room for error there is. Do you want a story experience with very little need to get anything remotely right gameplay-wise? Bam, set it to story mode. No shame, I promise. Do you want to brag to others about how much better you are at playing games in a futile attempt to make yourself feel better about your life? Boom, set it to the hardest difficulty and prepare to brag after being miserable for most of the game. definitely no shame either. All's well that ends well, right? Well, actually no, because if I'm being completely honest, I don't think that difficulty options as they are currently presented in most games are an optimal way to experience the concept of difficulty in a video game. To some of you this may sound crazy. What's wrong with giving people options? After all, shouldn't people be able to decide what kind of experience they want to have for games? Some people play video games for the story, so they play on the easiest difficulty to skip past the pain of learning gameplay mechanics that they simply don't want to learn. Others just don't have the time to fail over and over again, all for the sake of learning a game. Others just want to have fun, and killing everything in your path is their idea of fun. I could go on for different reasons, but the most important idea here is that many people think that nothing is lost on lower difficulties, and you can get the same experience for any game when playing on any difficulty. Even famous long-form video essayists that I love and am inspired by think this, and they have some valid points. But allow me first to present my own counter-arguments. In order to do that, let's jump back and compare Elden Ring to another game, one that tells a very different story about satisfaction in its combat system. Star Wars Jedi Survivor is a Souls-like game. It has almost all the elements from Dark Souls or Elden Ring or any other FromSoft game, just fill in the blank. It even has most of the same core mechanics. But why do you think not as many people talk about how satisfying it is to play this game? Or either of the Star Wars Jedi games. Both of them borrow so much from the Souls games, but I don't usually hear from anybody about how rewarding it is to win a fight, or to beat a particular boss. If I'm honest, there are probably a couple reasons for this, like different demographics playing the game, or those people caring more about the world and the story, but I think a lot of people don't realize that one of the biggest reasons for this is because there are multiple difficulty levels that you can adjust at any time. If you're dying over and over again, no big deal, just drop that difficulty like it's hot. No need to learn what you were doing wrong, and therefore no need to learn how to play the game. That discussion I was talking about earlier, the one where you are communing about your gameplay experiences, now has multiple layers of complexity. When I'm comparing my experience to someone who is playing on a different difficulty, we can't share the same accomplishment. The final boss could have been a cakewalk for my friend, but I was fighting for my life till the bitter end, even if I was a more skilled player. This lack of a shared experience makes the game less memorable, and I think weakens the overall experience. What's ironic about this is that Jedi Survivor is actually a super satisfying game to play. I won't spoil it for people who haven't played it, but there's a mini-boss that I encountered really early on that I was not prepared for, yet I decided to try over and over again until I won. I memorized attack patterns, parry timings, I threw myself at this behemoth over and over again until I was finally victorious. And guess what? I faintly felt that FromSoft feeling. Say that 5 times fast. But it wasn't quite the same, because I know not only are people achieving this accomplishment without working as hard, but I didn't even need to go through all the suffering to see the same victory screen that others have. And during the fight there was a constant nagging in the back of my head, asking if I should turn the difficulty down. While I never did and my self-control prevailed, knowing I could have turned the difficulty down, combined with the fact that I am not overcoming the same challenges as most other people, makes me look on the game a little less fondly, because the only thing stopping me from making things easier was my own willpower. And yes, while it is technically my own willpower that keeps me playing a difficult game and dying over and over again, you don't realize this yet because there is no choice to go to easy mode, and turning back or quitting isn't a viable option for many people. In Jedi Survivor, you always have an easy way out. You may be thinking, well sure, maybe Jedi Survivor isn't as memorable or communal, but that doesn't mean the game is actually worse. Well, I wish I could say that, but a game like this with multiple difficulties makes things a bit weird. What I mean by that is when there is a lack of a streamlined difficulty, this produces an experience that essentially runs the opposite of what a game with an extremely tight and responsive combat system should. Jedi Survivor's difficulty philosophy and the player experience seem to be at a mismatch, because these systems that the game borrows are meant to push you towards mastery. Experience point gain, strict checkpoint systems, and carefully placed enemies should contribute to this, but without that streamlined and intentional difficulty balance, it undermines itself. In other words, the mechanics that the game lifts from FromSoft games work better in those games because of having only one difficulty. And yes, I understand that this is kind of the point, the fact that you don't have to rely on these fundamental systems so that more people can be happy and experience the game. I just don't think players should be given this option, Because by making the systems that are the foundation of your game almost pointless, albeit intentionally, you're not giving players the tools to learn in a genre about learning attack patterns and learning to persevere. Now, some people think that the ideal goal of a lower difficulty is actually not what I described. For some, the ideal goal of a difficulty is that everyone selects the perfect difficulty for them, which allows them to experience the game like anybody else. That these mechanics would matter to everyone on their difficulty because their need is dependent on your skill relative to the difficulty level. As I reread this line, it probably sounds confusing, but the best way I can describe this is that players playing on easy would find the checkpoint and experience gain systems as challenging and rewarding as the people playing on normal and hard. It would be as much of a test since theoretically every player is playing on the quote correct end quote difficulty. Every player would be challenging themselves the appropriate amount. The biggest issue with this is that players don't fit into easy little boxes titled easy, normal, and hard, or whatever else you want to call it. I don't even know how someone might measure player skill this objectively. When playing almost any game, I often succeed in various areas and fail in others. Not only that, but we get to decide on a difficulty ourselves and before the game starts, so really it's a crapshoot to even get in the same ballpark at times. It's also debatable on if this is how difficulty should work. Some people want an easier experience at the cost of not learning the game correctly, and this is closer to what I described previously. I believe this is the philosophy that deserves the most critiquing, and it is exactly what I am criticizing. And it would be one thing to have two difficulty options, one for a pure story experience and one for a regularly designed playthrough. This way people can experience Cal's journey without devoting a ton of time to learning the game. But Jedi Survivor has 5 difficulties, ones that give leeway in the combat, and ones that make things as punishing as possible from the get-go. And while this allows more people to experience the game, it doesn't allow for everybody to learn the game properly. Instead, I think more games need to rely on a natural difficulty progression to provide a challenge. Difficulty curves still exist in games with changeable difficulties, but in my experience, games without one have, on average, a more reliable and balanced difficulty level throughout. A good example of this that's a bit more easygoing than Elden Ring is almost any Zelda game except for Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Their tight and linear design allows for a balanced increase in difficulty where your arsenal grows, and so do the different types of enemies and puzzles. As the game goes on, you'll have to use different items to conquer different scenarios, enemies, and dungeons. My favorite Zelda games treat Link as a growing roster of tools to use, which gives the game a sense of mastery. They are by no means the hardest games, but I've never walked away from a Zelda game feeling like it got easier, or that I didn't slowly master the game and what it had to offer. This leads us to 2 quick, purely speculative arguments. 1. Part of the issue might be that games are designed around multiple difficulties. It seems to be a trend to include them in your game, and if you are including them, they are going to have to be good, else your difficulty options are just as inaccessible to people as if they weren't there. And this is why I think a lot of games tend to stick with systems that are easier to balance, like parry timing or stealth detection. These can seemingly be adjusted with simple stat increases and decreases. Some games even have the option to change this specific aspect yourself, but this approach to difficulty feels very limiting. Think of possible gameplay mechanics that don't have easily adjustable stats, things like dialogue options or using logic to solve puzzles. Difficulty is often handled extremely poorly for these types of mechanics. Some games like Resident Evil don't even have a difficulty for puzzles, just for combat, and the puzzles are the most compelling part of the game. Developers may also shy away from having a more unique mechanic in their game because it may be difficult to implement into a multi-level difficulty scheme. But again, that's just me spitballing, because I have never made a game in my entire life. This is just how it feels playing them for over 20 years. 2. Publishers may be forcing or highly encouraging developers to implement difficulty levels. This would explain why so many difficulties are poorly balanced. It's no secret that publishers have a very large influence on the development of a game. It often feels like when the going gets rough and a publisher wants something done, what the publisher says has immediate priority over developer opinion. That may even extend to gameplay mechanics and systems like difficulty. After all, difficulty options are a good way to make sure everyone is, quote, happy, end quote. It just comes at a cost that I don't think some publishers and upper executives may realize. That cost being a saturation of game mechanics and systems that get boring without it being finely balanced. I don't like either of these problems, and not just because they're big problems. It's because they don't stem from a lack of creativity or effort. They most likely stem from wanting the game to sell well and an avoidance of risk. Honestly, these problems may be impossible to solve as long as AAA game companies are around. I mean, think of any independent games you've played, and the ones that mean the most to you. When I do this, I often think of games that are groundbreaking and go against popular gameplay mechanics, and surprise, not all of them contain difficulty options. But for now, these problems feel more like necessary evils than issues that we can feasibly solve. Now, before we move on, I briefly want to make one thing very clear. There is a big difference between accessibility and difficulty level. Some people may think that I am gatekeeping, or saying that only certain people should play games, and that it requires a certain barrier to entry. That is simply not true. I want everyone to be able to experience the joy of learning and mastering a game, regardless of any circumstance. I am arguing for a better implementation of teaching and learning rather than just using difficulty as a crutch and calling it a day. Difficulty is not accessibility options. Just to make it clear again, I want those in games. They belong in every single one. Overall, the entire point of this section is that not every game should have difficulty options. In fact, many more games probably shouldn't. There are often significant and overlooked advantages to restricting your opponent's difficulty options to fewer rather than many. Although I want to make it clear that I am not trying to argue that there should be no difficulty options in every single game. I recognize that having more difficulty options also has its advantages. I just think games should be careful in how they decide to implement them, because there are many games that would benefit much more without them. Ones that could offer a better natural difficulty curve, even if a natural difficulty curve is really hard to get right.
Look out! Wow!
Kingdom Hearts 2 is a pretty good game with a pretty good combat system. It starts slow, but ends up being fast, fluid, responsive, and allows you to strategize without ever slowing down. Its enemy design and your moves can be on the simpler side, yet it never gets old. Attacks are flashy and satisfying, spells have use, items come in clutch, and the drive system is a perfect power boost mechanic that allows you to get out of some tough situations. You'll always be entertained by combat, if you play the game like it's meant to be played, because Kingdom Hearts 2 is an amazing example of a few overpowered game mechanics that completely break combat. And there's not just one, there's like 5, it's nuts. And when you have so many things break your game, that's a bad thing, because another pitfall of difficulty is an imbalanced moveset that makes games a little less interesting and fun to play. Player options and the balance of those options are one of the most important aspects to making a game difficulty, and therefore a game that works. In regards to Kingdom Hearts 2, there are 2 out of many that I will discuss really quick: Reflect and Stun Locking. Reflect is a spell that allows you to absorb enemy attacks and deal damage back at the enemies. This spell wouldn't be too broken if you had to time it well and use it wisely, but you don't have to, because the game has such a little window for using this in error that you're able to consistently abuse it. All you have to do is time your initial Reflect spell and then spam it, because for some reason they decided that the spell can combo into itself. Even worse, there's barely anything limiting its use. Now, normally casting any spell takes magic points, or MP. This is a resource that you have a finite amount of, and after using up all your available MP, Sora is sent into cooldown where it slowly regenerates. This should be an interesting game mechanic that acts as a balance to using magic, but this kind of gets thrown out the window because this spell is just so broken and you can level so many enemies before you run out of MP. What makes matters worse is that there are items that allow you to replenish it faster. If you don't have those precious items, you can also wait around for it to regenerate. This means that a valid critical mode playstyle quickly becomes spam Reflect, wait for my magic to regenerate, then finish off the scraps with normal attacks, and repeat. It not only makes the game's difficulty a joke, it's also pretty trivial. The biggest shame about all this is that this combat system has a ton of promise. Not using Reflect this way, or any other broken mechanic, makes the combat much more interesting and difficult. All spells use MP, with healing taking the most amount possible at all times, meaning you have to choose between using magic offensively and delaying your heal at the risk of dying, or letting cure rip at all times. This is risk versus reward, and it's kinda important, and we'll talk about it super soon, but it's semi-tainted by a spell that is so overly broken it makes very little sense not to use it as a regular attack. Stun locking is also a big issue to Kingdom Hearts 2's otherwise amazing combat system. When you use your Keyblade by pressing the attack command, you execute a chain of hits until you land a combo finisher. This combo finisher does the most damage and has the most hit stun, meaning your opponent can't act for longer than normal attacks. But this combo finisher usually makes you unable to move after you finish executing it. How this plays out practically means that you can get about 2 combo strikes in on a boss before they start their attacks again. You can use abilities that you acquire throughout the game to reduce or lengthen these combos. But something funny happens when you use abilities abilities, and equipment to reduce your combos down to the minimum possible value of 1. When you are only ever doing the combo finisher, for some reason you're able to act before the boss no matter what. By performing a pattern of jump, attack, land, you can beat even the hardest super boss with ease. Usually this boss kills you faster than you can blink, but get one opening and you'll win as long as you keep up the pace. All you have to do is memorize timings, say goodbye to any semblance of strategy. With this, Kingdom Hearts 2 becomes a rhythm game, with one beat, one button to push, and one boring song. Earlier, I mentioned the words risk and reward. These are two fundamental ideas to any game literally ever. How much will you put on the line, and how much will you gain? For video games specifically, it feels like the toolset needs to be as strong enough to take down anything, but only at great potential cost. For example, if you time a parry in an action game right, you get more opportunities to attack, or sometimes even get a super powerful attack. You mistime it, and you're wide open. This is what makes combat in games so engaging. When do you attack? When do you block? When do you parry? When will Donald heal you? Yet with these two issues that Kingdom Hearts 2 has, for most of the game's length, it throws every single question I just asked completely out the window. I think that out of all the difficulty problems I talk about today, this is easily the most prevalent in games. For example, in Persona 5 Royal, if you have the right DLC, battles come down to using Myriad Truths, a multiple target attack that goes through all weaknesses. Use this attack over and over again, and almost nothing can touch you. It's a certified win button. My Witcher 3 playthrough is all about spamming Quen, a shield spell that protects you from damage. Upgrade it and it only makes things easier. And remember how I mentioned FromSoft games? And remember how I said that the only way to successfully beat them is learning enemy attack patterns and persevering through the best of times and the blurst of times?
The blurst of times?
Well, that's kind of a lie when it comes to Elden Ring, because if you know the right build, the game becomes a lot easier. I could go on and on with different examples of games that I've played with poor difficulty balancing, but can you at least see how difficult it is to actually create a balanced game? How one small attack or overtuned defensive maneuver can completely break your game? It's almost a miracle that not every single game suffers from poor game balancing. Let's further examine a game that does power scaling really well, and hopefully see why. Let's talk very briefly about Metroid. Metroid as a series has a few ingredients that contribute to its core identity. Among these, and the most important for what we are going to talk about today, is increasing power levels. Samus grows stronger and more capable as time goes on. She gains new suits, new powers, new abilities, new moves, and depending on the game, even new DNA. The entire game is about getting stronger, and by getting stronger, you can explore more areas. This provides a unique feedback loop that not only makes you feel stronger in combat, but in traversal too. But this provides a problem. If Samus gets stronger, how does the game maintain a sense of challenge throughout? It's all about not leaving any room for this in your core mechanics. Regarding combat specifically, the Metroid games I have played do a fantastic job at not making you too overpowered when facing enemies in your current area. While you demolish earlier opponents, there are still high-level enemies that are deemed a threat that you have yet to face. The key idea here is that none of Samus's attacks that she gains bypass the current challenge you are facing. You cannot mindlessly press a win button. That would be crazy, and rightfully so. There is no reflect spell, no limit form, no summons, and certainly no stun locking. The beams and abilities you get are not only contextual, but also needed for the level of challenge you are currently at. But most importantly, when you do get these upgrades, how you play the game rarely ever changes. You always have to position and shoot regardless of upgrade. Kingdom Hearts 2, on the other hand, introduces a number of mechanics that fundamentally change how you play. And once you play that way, why would you ever play any way else? Now, Metroid is an interesting positive example to use because its gameplay is so simple. It's aim and shoot with a parry mechanic in Dread. Even in Metroid Prime, enemies are puzzles, not tests of skill. But what this simplicity does is it allows the game to be easy to balance. The more complex a game is, with multiple systems and dozens of different attacks to do at once, it becomes harder to balance everything well. This is a natural consequence of so many systems interacting for so long. This is a situation where games of higher complexity just need to hit a standard, a bar that's good enough. I don't think Kingdom Hearts 2, with its dozens of broken systems, meets that bar. I don't think many games today meet that bar. But maybe you want broken mechanics in games, and honestly that's kind of fair. Kingdom Hearts 2 can be fun because you're summoning Stitch and making your magic meter bottomless. I certainly see the appeal to that. Some games are based on the very idea that you're just blowing up everything around you, stomping poor little peasants in the ground while you laugh. I get this, and these games have their place, primarily because I like some of those games. It's fun to take a rocket launcher and proceed to one-shot everything that stands in your way, but I think in most games, this mechanic does not belong as a primary tool. Ideally, I think most games are meant to be learned, mastered, and beaten. and there's a big difference between starting overpowered and becoming overpowering. I have way less of an issue with games that allow you to break your own character by leveling up, but games that allow you to have broken moves right off the bat is something that I think hurts a game design, not helps it. I honestly think the more pressing issue when arguing for an imperfect difficulty balance is taking into account people who like to speedrun. Like last time, I want to make something clear. I am not against breaking a game if it's something like an Ocarina of Time dungeon skip. Leave that to the community to use and abuse. Those are oversights in games anyways. I'm against a fundamental mechanic to a game being so overpowered that there's little to no use in a majority of players using other options. While I admit that examples from Kingdom Hearts 2 are a little niche, I was able to abuse and even replicate these so easily that I'm going to count it as something that anyone can do, not just the most skilled speedrunners. I also already hear some people typing in the comments already, but if the game gives you a broken abusable option, why don't you just ignore it? It's your choice to use it. This argument works at a surface level, but completely falls apart, because once a player knows how to win, how many people do you think will actually abstain from this method to make the game more fun? Not many. As I've said before, knowing is half the battle, and if players know of a way to easily beat any enemies or obstacles the game throws at you, well, kiss any semblance of good game design goodbye, and throw it out the window for good measure. While I like all the games with problems that I just listed, there's certainly victims to poor balancing that could easily be solved with a little tuning. But that begs a whole different question. How do you even tune difficulty? How do you even make a game hard or easy? That's a question that's way more complicated than you might think, because certain games also do this better than others. The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt is one of the most acclaimed games of the past decade. The reason it gets such high praise from so many is because it has a gripping storyline, great side quests, interesting moral dilemmas, characters you will love, and characters you will love to hate. But let's just say that Witcher 3 did not win Game of the Year for its gameplay. The game is an action RPG, and its combat comes down to killing your enemies with one of your two swords in real-time combat. You have strong attacks, fast attacks, a parry, a counterattack, several different spells called signs, and different potions and oils with different effects. You even have a bestiary where you can study all the monsters you face and their weaknesses to properly prepare for every fight. All of these mechanics should combine to create a deep combat experience that is satisfying, where you have to use your entire arsenal of weapons and signs to survive a battle. You should be studying enemies, preparing potions and oils to survive, and it should be a brutal test of the player's skills with a blade or two. Nope, because The Witcher 3 is a good example of a really, and I'm talking really, bad difficulty balance. What the developers decided to change in Witcher 3's hardest mode to make it hard is not great. Sorry Witcher 3, I really enjoy you, but you have some major issues. The major differences between Death March, which is the hardest difficulty, and normal are experience point gain, how Geralt recovers health, enemy damage, and enemy health. Those last two are fairly standard. Enemies will do more damage to you, and it will take more swings to kill enemies. But here's the thing. It's combined with the fact that you also gain less experience from all quests. This means that for the early game, you'll be underleveled as you brave White Orchard or Velen. On top of that, you can't recover health instantly when you are outside of combat. You have to use Swallow, or food, and wait. Both of these take resources. At first, this doesn't seem like a terribly implemented difficulty, not by a long shot, but past the surface, it's lacking in a lot. Particularly, it's kind of boring and it's very poorly balanced. Witcher 3's combination of stats leads us to waste in one of the most valuable resources ever. And that resource is time, because it takes longer to kill enemies, it takes longer to level up, and it takes really long to replenish your health by food. This often feels like it makes the game slower, which isn't a good thing. In the early game, you're waiting for your food or Swallow to heal you, waiting for you to level up after doing more quests than you feel like it should take because it statistically does, hitting enemies, waiting for them to die. And I hate waiting. And waiting around for something to happen is a pretty poor way to simulate the feeling of a harder experience. It's why you hear so many complaints about enemies being bullet sponges across so many different games. At first, it's definitely true here. It's frustrating to feel like you're spending so much time just chopping at a few immovable objects, and then a group of enemies just stunlock you and kill you in a few hits. But what's funny is that somewhere around Novigrad, most of these issues just suddenly stop, because I could very well have used Witcher 3 as an example in the first section of this video as well, because the game gets easier as time goes on. Your brutal start with no food is quickly eclipsed by raiding the common folks' houses for something to eat. You get upgrades to your character that are essentially keeping your vitality up and making sure you deal out more damage, dodging is easier, and making sure you take less hits. The entire rest of the game so far has been an absolute cakewalk. Witcher 3 is honestly ridiculous in how it handles difficulty. It's insane, and this is because CD Projekt Red decided to adjust the wrong numbers. Because at the end of the day, games are about numbers. Damage has to be calculated. Health has to be lost and subtracted from your total. Adrenaline and stamina have to be spent. And dice have to be rolled in an attempt to get lucky. And changing difficulty is about changing the numbers to make an experience require less error and more skill from the player. But what separates a good difficulty from a bad difficulty is which numbers not only to decrease and increase, but which combination of them to adjust. And most games do this in a basic and standard way, to create the illusion of a more difficult game. For example, like we just talked about in Witcher 3, it decreases all damage output and increases all damage taken, so that it takes longer to kill, but one mistake could be costly. But the best and honestly most fun difficulties get creative in how you adjust and play with the numbers. A bad difficulty balance doesn't. Before we discuss that, you may be wondering why I think it's necessary for a hard difficulty to be fun. After all, hard difficulty is supposed to be hard. And yes, I agree with that, but I think people forget that video games are also meant to be fun to play. And I think part of what makes a difficulty balance succeed is fun factor. When I remember accomplishments in games, I remember two things: the feeling leading up to the moment of triumph, and the moment of triumph itself. If the moments leading up to it aren't fun, rather than feeling accomplishment, I personally just feel exhausted. For a game that has all the accomplishment without the exasperated journey, let's turn once again to Kingdom Hearts 2.
Again? Again?
We already discussed Kingdom Hearts 2's combat system, so I won't over-explain it again. But this game has an incredibly fun balance in its highest difficulty. I actually think that this is the optimal way to play the game, and the ideas that it brings to the table are some that should be replicated by other games. When comparing Critical Mode, the game's hardest difficulty, and Normal, there are actually quite a few differences. Enemies do more damage, and you get less total max health, and you earn less experience from enemies. This, specifically for Kingdom Hearts 2, is a good thing. I can't tell you how easy it is to mash attack command on normal difficulty levels and just win. For Critical Mode, it makes you think about what swings you are going to do and when. Sounds pretty straightforward so far, right? Well, that's just the tip of the iceberg, because Kingdom Hearts 2's Critical Mode isn't your common hard difficulty that you find in most other games. In fact, there's 3 catches to its difficulty. Critical Mode has early access to skills and abilities, meaning that this is a true test of skill that gives you the necessary tools to succeed. You do more damage to overall enemies as well. When you do level up, you gain more ability points than normal mode, allowing you to gain more skills and be more powerful faster. All these things add up to a unique experience of being rewarded for playing on a harder difficulty. You can do as much damage to enemies as they do to you. In other words, the odds are even. You hit like a truck, but a tiny flick from an enemy will send you to your doom. It feels mostly fair, which is honestly pretty rare for a hard mode. This Critical Mode is a rare gem, and if the combat system didn't have the problems that I mentioned in the second part of this video, it would be a great example of how to balance a difficulty. Getting creative with your game's difficulty functions doesn't always work out well though. Not to rag on Persona 5 Royal again, but the game tries to get a little clever with its difficulty and it doesn't work out well. Persona 5 Royal is a turn-based combat game where almost every enemy has an elemental weakness. At the beginning of the game, you can select Story, Easy, Normal, Hard, and Merciless. Merciless is supposed to be the hardest difficulty, but how it works is that it triples the damage dealt when critical hits land to both enemies and yourself. This is similar to Kingdom Hearts 2. You all become glass cannons. There's just one problem. The entire gameplay is about hitting these weaknesses and critical hits. The game encourages you to do so at every possible moment. In fact, if you know what you are doing, rather than it being a fair challenge, it becomes a bit of a cakewalk. An experienced player will always ambush, always have personas for every possible situation, and always have the optimal party lineup for Joker's current roster of personas. Therefore, rather than testing skilled players, it rewards them in a negative way. The lesson to learn here is that developers should be careful about their new and unique difficulty as an actual fix to boring gameplay and harder difficulties. It's easy to implement a cool, powerful tool, only for it to make problem number 2 an even bigger issue if it isn't already. I will say that it is a shame that most of the hard work goes into the harder difficulties. Most of the focus on a conversation around difficulty is centered around games being hard, and if they're difficult enough and maybe too difficult. Nobody talks about the easy modes. If difficulty in games is already somewhat overlooked, I feel like easy modes in games are even more overlooked. For a good and creative example of an easy mode that adjusts the right things, I can think of Nier Automata. This game has what's called auto chips. These allow the game to essentially play itself. You get abilities that automatically do basic functions, like auto evade and auto attack. At first, it sounds like I should hate this feature, because it has the potential to make sure the player doesn't have to do anything. While this is technically true, I actually like this, because if a player is overwhelmed with a specific action, they can set the game to automatically do other actions that they may execute. They can then focus on the parts they do enjoy or need to learn, while slowly throwing in more and more mechanics at the player's will. Multitasking can often make an early and inexperienced player feel overwhelmed, so this difficulty is welcome in my eyes. Or the player may just write out the game with all the auto attacks on. That's up to them. More importantly, no systems ever become tedious or contradictory on lower difficulty levels. I'm looking at you, Jedi Survivor. Overall, if you had to take one thing away from this section, it's that not only do the numbers matter, but the correct combination of changing numbers matters. Because some numbers shouldn't be messed with. Others should, but aren't. But overall, it's more important to make a creative combination of number changes than a dull, unpredictable one. Because a difficulty that is creative and different and unique is not only more fun, it often leverages its combat system in more unique ways than simple damage adjustments ever could.
Whoa, in for one hell of a ride.
Difficulty is difficult. It's a massive mess, and I don't blame you if you think that this entire video is essentially saying, it depends, to hard questions on modern difficulty solutions. What I'm trying to say is this: games have a bigger difficulty problem than most people probably realize. Games shouldn't just shove difficulty options in it because it feels necessary. Games shouldn't make one powerful move trump everything else in the game. And games shouldn't be overly simplistic when it comes to balancing. But most of all, games shouldn't get away with doing a poor job with any of the areas I talked about. I'm making this video partly because problems of difficulty seem to loom in the shadows. You sometimes hear that difficulty is a problem in games, but you rarely hear why and how it can be solved. And to begin changing these problems starts with reevaluating how we look and interact with difficulty as a whole. I hope this video did a good enough job to not advocate for one difficulty style over any other, because part of the beauty of different games is the ability to be varied and diverse, and not being varied or diverse is the biggest roadblock to solving these problems presented in this video. But I hope that by watching you may think twice about picking your default difficulty option at the start screen, or maybe you'll think about what mechanics you've been abusing, or maybe even ponder how boring it might be to play on easy or hard. I hope that by watching this video, you might look at difficulty in games just a little bit differently. And if that happens, well, that's all I can ask for. Thank you for watching till the end, and until next time.